I'm really pleased to introduce this panel on U.S. politics and an evaluation of how polarized it is. I am bitterly disappointed I'm not able to be with you in the theater this evening because of some COVID restrictions that we still have applying here at Boston College. But this is a really appropriate panel for Boston College to introduce. The two panelists, and you'll hear much more of them from the moderator, Eileen Dunne, are graduates of Notre Dame and Georgetown, both, I think, rivals to Boston College as preeminent Catholic institutions in the case of Notre Dame, and as a Jesuit Catholic institution in the case of Georgetown. Boston College is really pleased to once again be involved with supporting the Kennedy Summer School and supporting endeavors that bring together Ireland, the United States, around issues of transatlantic importance, whether they be conversations on politics, culture, history, or economics. Again, I hope to see you next year at the Kennedy Summer School in person. Until then, though, I'm going to hand it over to my co-director, one of my co-directors, Eileen Dunne. Eileen.
Thanks, Bob. Lovely to hear you, and so sorry that you can't be with us this year, but we'll definitely look forward to seeing you next year. Now, I'm joined by Mick Mulvaney here in person. He's the Georgetown graduate, isn't that right?
I'm the Georgetown one, yes.
Yeah. And in a few moments, we hope that we'll be able to see Brendan Boyle.
I can make fun of him while he's not here if you want
You
me to.
can.
So.
I'm sure he can hear you, though. That might be the trick. So he's the Notre Dame. So two Irish-American politicians, one Republican, one Democrat. There you go, Brendan. How are you? Welcome to the session.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you. And yes, Mick, I was listening very carefully.
You actually got into Notre Dame? I didn't realize they had lowered the standards like that.
And man, it's starting already. But
well, they're doing divisiveness in American politics, so I thought we'd give them a little something like that. But I'm sorry, Eileen, go ahead.
So, Brendan is the representative for Pennsylvania, and Mick Mulvaney has served as White House Chief of Staff and also as Special Envoy to Northern Ireland during the Trump administration. And the topic we are addressing tonight is how polarized is America? And we thought we'd begin by asking the two speakers to maybe outline where they're coming from on this, what their position is, what they think, how polarized do they think America is. So they're going to do that for about 4 or 5 minutes, then we'll pick up on the discussion, and hopefully then at the end we'll be able to take some questions from the floor. I'd ask you to identify yourself, keep the question really short, because the people who are watching us online, and welcome to all of you too, they can't hear you, so I'll have to repeat the question. So we'll keep it as tight as we possibly can to get in as much as we possibly can. So, Mr. Mulvaney, I'm going to start with you. How polarized is America?
You know, I've heard the question I got as we were standing outside over the course of the afternoon was, you know, how divided is America? And then the other folks would ask me, how divided is the American government? And it's almost the same question with almost the same answer. I think the country is very divided. I think that it is. I do not think it happens to be divided because of its government. I think there are examples of when governments lead. I think there are examples of times when governments should lead, but I think generally speaking, especially in an elected government, governments tend to follow. What do I mean by that? I don't think the country is divided because Donald Trump was president. I think Donald Trump was president because the country is and remains fairly divided. There's a bunch of reasons for that. We could talk about those tonight if you like. I could list a couple of them. Be curious to think if Brendan thinks any of these apply. Number one, we don't share a lot of the same background anymore. My daughter just graduated from Georgetown University. I graduated there 30 years ago. We took the same classes. We went to the same school. There was one class that we took in common over the 4 years that each of us went to Georgetown University. We don't If you're Republican, you don't have much faith in institutions of higher learning, university. You think that somehow that's an operation of the left. If you're on the left-hand side, you might think that the evangelical churches or even the Catholic Church might be an element of the right-hand side, although Catholic is not exactly the best example. We are divided in so many ways. Social media contributes to that. I just found out, Brendan, I don't know if you heard this one or not. I was talking to Luntz, who does a little bit of work for the NFL, and they are really going to do the black national anthem at football games this year. I don't even know what that means. I don't even know what the black national anthem is, but now at the beginning of our football games, we'll be playing the Star Spangled Banner and then a song that I've never even heard before, and I'm being told it's an alternative American national anthem. So the country is very divided, and I think that leads to government being divided. Can government do better? Yes, but I also think we are just reflective of what the country is.
Okay, and Brendan?
Yeah, well, first, let me say, because we were joking around a little bit in the beginning, just what a pleasure it is to join all of you, albeit virtually. Was supposed to be with you in person this time last year, and then of course by that point COVID had struck, and now we're still living with it. So hopefully we'll be able to be there in person next year. But I am glad to be able to join you virtually, and I've been looking forward to having this discussion with my old friend Mick, because it's a fascinating topic and one that is so important right now. So as I've reflected on this question, and it's not the first time that I've gotten it, let me answer it in two different ways. The first, there is no question, and you can quantify this, that US politics today far more polarized than in previous generations. Let me just compare it to at least when I was in college in the mid 90s. I think Mick around the same time, you might be a little bit older than I am, but 25, 30 years ago, there were far more swing voters in the United States. You had far more moderate centrist Democratic senators from what we would call red states, and you had many more Republican senators and representatives from what we now call blue states. And by the way, that whole red state, blue state nomenclature we used didn't even exist 25, 30 years ago. You also saw presidential elections and congressional elections where, for example, 1964 Democratic election, Lyndon Johnson wins by over 20 percentage points. 8 years later, the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, wins by more than 20 percentage points. That is impossible to imagine today. There are just far fewer voters who would actually be open-minded enough to switch from party to party or maybe be ticket splitters. This was consistent in the Trump era as well. Biden's recent numbers show a little more than 90% approval from registered Democrats and under 10% from registered Republicans. And of course, Donald Trump's numbers were almost the exact reverse. So, and this also, you can see it in terms of congressional votes as well, where there are just, far fewer bipartisan votes today. Let me point out one thing, though, that helped contribute to that, and that is we now have two ideologically pure political parties. The US and Ireland actually have something, have a lot in common, but something that is not often commented on, and that is the US for more than a century, our two-party system really grew out of the aftermath of our Civil War. Very similar to Ireland with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Sometimes it's a joke that, it's hard to tell the difference between the main two Irish parties. It was also the case in the US that you would have moderate, even conservative Democrats, especially from the South, and you would have very liberal Democrats, especially from urban areas. On the Republican side, you would have progressive to liberal Republicans, as well as very conservative ones. So that actually created an incentive for both parties to attempt to play to the middle. Now, I said I would answer this, and I'll try to be more brief with the second part of this. I said there's another level to it, though. If you go to a football game this weekend, it's the opening of college football, next weekend's the opening of the NFL, you would see Democrats there, you would see Republicans there. You wouldn't hear much conversation about politics. I still, on the ground level, And in day-to-day life, I still don't observe or experience polarization the way it's maybe sometimes portrayed in the media and especially nationally. So I think it's important that we keep that distinction in mind. Yes, our politics have polarized, no question. But still, there's far more coming together in society, at least from what I observe and experience.
Yeah, can
It's fascinating. I never, Brendan, I hadn't thought about it that way until you just said it. And I want to tell you a story and see if where it fits. Because you and I are friends, and you're a Democrat and I'm a Republican. I was texting with Peter Welch today. Joe Kennedy is not here, and I'm giving him a really hard time that you and I are speaking at the Kennedy School before Joe has spoken here. Joe's a Democrat, former member of Congress, ran for Senate in Massachusetts and lost. And certainly, there is no animosity between us. You and I work together. You've worked with Republicans before, and folks don't see that because it just doesn't make news. Okay, that's a good message. Here's what I worry about. I spoke to a group of young people at the University of Southern California about 6 months ago. And it was their honors scholars program. It's the smartest kids they have, and there's 30 of them in the room. And I'm on a virtual thing with John Carl from ABC News. And John and I are debating impeachment. And John and I have differing opinions about impeachment. We go back and forth, and then John has to go off and do something, and I stay with the students. And this young woman asked me, she goes, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, yes, ma'am. She goes, "Are you friends with that other man?" And I said, "Yeah, I am. We go to baseball games together, and like our kids go to school. I'm friends." "Why do you ask it like that?" And she goes, "Well, I've been raised to know that everybody is entitled to his and her own opinion, and every opinion is just as valid as anybody else's, and I should respect that opinion, but I could never be friends with somebody I disagreed with." That was a stunning commentary. So while our generation has the ability to do those types of things, I wonder if that polarization is becoming such as we're actually teaching the younger people not to do it. And that bothered me. That may be the most dangerous thing I've heard in the last 18 months.
And Brendan, you talked about how the polarization has increased over the last 30 years, say. There was a survey done last year, I think, by Brown University, where polarization in America is increasing faster than in Canada, in Germany, in the UK, or in Australia. What Simon Schama called the divided states of America. What do you think is contributing to that?
There is no question, and this is not, I don't bash the media in a knee-jerk way. It's always easy to bash politicians and bash the media. So I hope this doesn't come off like that sort of, not very thoughtful knee-jerk bashing. But I am going to be critical in the media in this sense. The media environment, particularly because of technology today, allows for us to receive our news from self-selected sources. So, for example, when Mick and I were growing up, I was growing up, I'll speak for myself, in the 1980s, it wasn't a very different media environment than the 1950s or 1960s. 3 major TV networks in the United States. Cable news was, CNN existed, but very few people had it, was really in its infancy. Certainly no internet, let alone social media. And you also had multiple, in most metro areas like city of Philadelphia, you had multiple daily newspapers. In fact, one in the morning, one that would come out in the afternoon, and one in the Evening Bulletin. That's a very different media environment than my daughter, who is 7, is being raised in. It is very easy for one group of Americans to get all of their news from one source, a cable TV network that reinforces their views, websites that reinforces their views, social media, etc., and then the same on the other side. And I have to say, while I am by nature an optimist and tend to be optimistic, I'm not optimistic on this front. I don't see, certainly we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle, and I don't see how that problem gets solved anytime soon. I will also say, while this problem may be worse in the United States right now, it is not a challenge that any Western democracy is immune from. And so I would bear that in mind, especially as we look at some other countries where political extremism has been on the rise.
Yeah. And why aren't they immune from it? Because the reason that they do it in the United States, the reason you have MSNBC on one side and Fox on the other, and Brendan is very gracious to them using the term news. They're not news. They're mostly opinion and reaffirmation. And in fact, sometimes they will take the same exact facts and tell two entirely different stories about it. One of the biggest frustrations I have after having left the White House is that I got real information when I was in the White House. I didn't have to get it through a filter. Now that I'm an ordinary citizen, I have to go out and try and find it through a filter. And finding real news, factual news, is very, very difficult to do. But why is it a risk? Because that's how they make money. They figured out there's a lot of money in outrage. There's a lot of money in opinion. There's a lot of money in telling you are absolutely right. And everything that you think about whatever happened with COVID or Afghanistan or whatever, we are going to sit here and reaffirm that for you. And you are going to, buy pillows from us as a result. There's a great deal of money in outrage, and there is no reason to think the United States is alone in sort of that environment.
Well, you mentioned earlier, government needs to do better. I mean, a question to you both. Brendan, you talked about Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They have coalesced here to keep the centre holding. So is there a greater responsibility on politicians to do something about this?
Well, I mean, we could get really political sciencey and point to the difference between a strong party system and a weak party system. U.S. has a weak party system. We're more entrepreneurial. I mean, I wasn't tapped by the Democratic Party when I first ran for office.
Right.
In fact, somewhat the opposite. I went out and did it and put together a campaign, and that's typically the way candidates operate here. So it would be much more challenging. Also, remember, in a parliamentary system, there are many parties, and so part of what may have motivated, for example, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil was competition from other parties. In the U.S., we are a two-party system. Structurally speaking, it is almost impossible to have a third party. And if a third party were to emerge and get popular enough, frankly, it would knock out one of the other two major parties, and you'd still have a two major party system. In fact, that's what happened right around the politics of the U.S. Civil War in the mid-19th century. So I have to say, the idea of Democrats and Republicans working together writ large so the center can hold, I would not foresee happening anytime soon. Although what you do sometimes see is a few members of each party, especially at a time right now when both the House and the margins in the House of Representatives and the Senate are as close as they've ever been. And so you do see some individual senators and individual members working with some allies on the other side to attempt to influence policy in that way.
Mick?
It's hard to do what he just said, by the way. It really is, especially in the House. You can do it in the Senate because the rules are different, but if Brendan, for example, were to go rogue on a particular issue and side with the Republicans, there would be a high price to pay for that politically. He's right about third party is highly unlikely to rise up in the United States of America in any of our lifetimes. The rules almost don't even allow it. We have two independents in the Senate, but in order for them to have any power, they have to caucus with one party or the other. If Brendan and I want to start our own third party in the House, there's actually nothing in the rules that would allow us to sit on any committees. So the rules, and then we haven't even started to talk about the money and how easy it is for parties to raise money. If I go out as an independent candidate, you might be able to give me a maximum of, say, $5,000 over the course of an election cycle. If I go out as a Republican, you can only give me $5,000, but you can give my party $250,000. So the system is set for the two parties. So I think Brendan's right. You're not likely to see it. What you're likely to see instead is the parties change, which they have. I'm the first Republican. People perceive, even in Washington, D.C., even in my own country, people perceive South Carolina as a hardcore red or Republican state. When I was elected in 2010, I was the first Republican in 130 years in that state. we were always conservative Southern Democrats. That meant you were pro-life, you're very fiscally conservative. You were pretty much a Republican, but the party changed. The Republican Party has changed. Nelson Rockefeller could never be a Republican today. It's unlikely that Ronald Reagan could be elected in a Republican primary today. So the parties do change. I think that's what you'll see. Instead of new parties coming up, the parties that exist will continue to evolve.
But how do you see that evolution?
Sooner or later, someone's going to figure out that as my party goes further this way and Brendan's party goes further this way, that there's going to be a critical mass of people in the middle. That's easier to do at the national level. It's very difficult to do at the U.S. Congressional district level. And it's also easier to do in general elections and not primaries. Part of the difficulty we face is that only roughly about 20 to 25% of the House of Representatives seats are really in play in any particular year. That leaves 75% that are not. What do I mean by that? My district right now, it's unlikely for a Democrat to get elected in my district at any time in the near future. And if I'm running for office in that district today, it was different in 2010, I don't even have to appeal to Democrats to get votes because there's not enough of them to make a difference. In fact, if I do appeal to Democrats, it might turn off some folks on the far right and I might lose support. My district will be won and lost in a primary. Whoever wins the Republican primary will win that office. And so appealing to the mass of folks on the left of center can actually be counterproductive. That's why you see them start to evolve. When you change that, if you can figure out a way to change that and figure out a way to reward folks who can speak to both sides, then you can figure out how to change that system. Excuse me.
Brendan, how do you see this evolving?
Yeah, so first, Mick and I are sort of the mirror images of one another because his old district in South Carolina is as Republican as mine is Democratic. You know, Joe Biden and other Democrats won, and myself included, more than 70% of the vote last election, and it's pretty typical. So where I would potentially, if I were to lose, it would almost 100% it would have to be in a primary and not a general election. And that's the vast majority of members of the House will be in similar situations. And in fact, and this is part of what frustrates me, frankly, about our primaries, is that, you know, on a couple of votes where, say, I've worked with Republicans or have a more centrist view, that will be used against me. And so you will hear sometimes in the House of Representatives someone say something to the effect of, oh, hey, listen, I'd like to work with you on that, but I'm concerned about being primaried. Or they might not be that explicit, but it's implicit. So in my view, until we change our primary system, and some states are experimenting with this, California, Washington. I'm really interested in the reform the state of Alaska put in that will take effect in the 2022 election, where everyone runs regardless of party in the same primary, and then the top 4 candidates advance to the general. So that way a candidate like Lisa Murkowski is a very moderate Republican senator, voted to impeach Trump, or I should say voted to convict Trump after he had been impeached. She is going to be attempting to win basically by putting together Republican votes, but also some Democratic votes, because she'll have more conservative opposition. A number of big cities and other local areas are moving to ranked choice voting. You saw that in the New York City mayor's race most recently. So in my view, until we change in the US our primary system, I think that we will continue to see members who want to reach across the aisle actually being punished for doing so.
Please allow that to sink in, because I think, if anything, and Brendan and I are friends, despite my dig at Notre Dame, and Notre Dame, I'll say something nice about it, is still a Catholic university, despite the fact that Georgetown is no longer. You guys are doing at least a nice job with that. It could actually, in theory, be bad for him politically to be doing this, because I'm a Trumper. I'm a right-wing nut job. I'm associated with, you know, the devil. And the simple fact that I might say something nice about him could be used against him. By the way, Brendan, thanks for doing this. This is a lot of fun. But there's a guy, you'll know, I won't give the name, but when I was nominated for the director of the Office of Management and Budget, somebody who was a Democrat in the Senate at the time actually wrote a letter of recommendation for me to the Trump administration, because we'd served together in the House, we'd served on committees together, and the person just thought I was a decent guy and knew how to count, which is what you do when you run the Office of Management and Budget. When I come time to come up for Senate confirmation, I go in and sit down with this person, we talk for a while, and we have great times, and at the end of the conference, he goes, you know I'm not going to vote for you. I'm like, yeah, that's fine, because if he voted for me, even though he recommended me for the job, as a Democrat, if he'd voted for me, it could hurt him politically. It's one of the reasons I'm glad to be done with elected politics, because the fact that Brendan's my friend, or I'm friends with Joe Kennedy, if that could ever be used against me, it's not a business I want to be in, and it's getting very close to that. By the way, Brendan, put this in the back of your mind. The one thing we talked about in the South, and I actually floated it very briefly one time with Jim Clyburn, was what we used to use in local elections, which was weighted voting. So keep in mind, you don't have to, districts are not a creation of the Constitution. We choose to do that.
Right.
We have 7 seats in South Carolina. We send 7 people from South Carolina. We don't have to do it by district. We could give you a ballot and say, give us 7 people you want to go. And you could put 7 names down. You could do single shot voting and do 1. It's very similar to what you talked about in the preference voting. So there are ways around it, but it will be slow to reform, because keep in mind, you're talking about taking power away from people who have it. And people don't like doing that.
Now, is there not another problem then, that even despite the fact that there are 2 parties, even within those parties, there are almost 2 parties? There's a right wing and a left wing in each of them.
Well, there has to be. It's a country of 350 million people. We only have 2 parties. No parties could be monolithic. They're going to have a center and a left. We're going to have a center on the right. I don't think that's surprising or troublesome. I don't know, Brendan, you guys, we beat the hell out of each other all the time within our own parties. It's what we do, right?
Yeah, I mean, right now, actually, so Democrats have about a 4-seat majority in the House of Representatives. It's tied in the Senate. Democrats' majority is based on the tie-breaking vote of the vice president. And we're right now, literally this month, attempting to push through a big part of the president's agenda. And so is the party that's in power, but has this very narrow majority. We are attempting to navigate that, and with some of our more centrist members and some of our most progressive members, knowing that we have a very small margin of error. Because the reality is, if you are going to be able to achieve a majority, it means that that's going to be a pretty, that spectrum within your party is going to have a certain amount of ideological diversity. There are always those, by the way, who want to purify your party and get it down to the most hardcore true believers, which in our system is a path toward being out of power, because you might have a very pure room, but it'll be a very small room, and it'll be the other side that makes the decisions. When Republicans were in charge 4 years ago, they ran into these issues, attempting to pass their agenda. They succeeded on the big tax cut. They failed on repealing the ACA. And so now, 4 years later, on the Democratic side, we were able to really succeed with the American Rescue Plan, which was Biden's out-of-the-box first big COVID bill. And now we're attempting to do that on infrastructure. So I think that's a pretty, that doesn't bother me in any way. I think that's attempting to keep your coalition together. I like to say that in my view, analyzing it, one way in which parliamentary democracy and the US system seems so different, and yet in some way are not really as different as they seem, is that for parliamentary systems, the coalitions enter in their negotiations after the election. In the US, essentially, you do have, both parties are a coalition of different interests and somewhat different ideologies, but those negotiations take place first. And then you go, to battle in the general election versus the other side. So when you think of it in that way, each of the 2 major US parties as a coalition of groups that at least have something in common, then it starts to resemble something that most Europeans say would be more familiar with.
Can you speak to that black anthem that Mick spoke about a while ago? Did you know about that? I mean, such a
It's
divisive.
it's a song I'm very it's a song that's very familiar with and happen to like. It is sometimes nicknamed the Black National Anthem, but if you campaign or go to service in a Black church, um, uh, which in the United States, African Americans have a very strong tradition of being rooted in the Christian church, sometimes actually nicknamed the Black Church. That is often sung at services. It comes out of the Christian tradition. Most African Americans in the U.S. would be somewhere in the evangelical Protestant category of Christianity. I'm not quite as bothered by that as maybe Mick is, although I would never want to get into a situation in which African Americans only observe the Black national anthem and white Americans only observed what is the traditional national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. I would not ever want that to happen. I don't fear that will. I mean, the patriotism of most African Americans is something that is not often written about or gets a lot of attention. Serve in the military in bigger numbers than their percentage of the population. So I have to say that I'm not maybe as concerned about it as some others.
Do you not think it will be divisive? I mean, I was just reading during the week about Megan Rapinoe, the soccer captain, the ladies' soccer captain. 48% of people polled wanted Subway to withdraw their support for her. I mean, that's split right down the middle.
Well, that might get back to, and I'm sorry, I'm not as familiar with the controversy with her, but you do see on a lot of things, I mean, COVID and the vaccines, another one, very frustrating the way this has been seen through the political spectrum, through that political lens. There are, when we went to the first question and talked about polarization, there are a number of things now that are being seen through that political lens that in a previous generation just weren't politicized in the same way. And that I find enormously frustrating.
You probably didn't hear our previous speaker, but he was one of our virologists, one of our COVID experts here who was being interviewed. Mick, you did.
Yeah.
And I mean, he was making the point that in this country, we all bunch together. We've got almost 90% of people vaccinated now, and it makes a difference to the outcome.
It does. And listen, we ended up having a pandemic at the same time that we had a national election. And I think we'd be joking with ourselves if we said that both sides didn't politicize the pandemic. It just did. And both sides paid the price for it. The Trump administration lost the election in part over its handling of the COVID crisis. And now the Biden administration is struggling with some of the same rhetoric that it used against Trump in the first place. What do I mean by that? It was a catchphrase during the election, just listen to the scientists, okay? I used to run the COVID task force right before it was called that. And I can assure you that we had scientists who were all over the map on different things. Anthony Fauci told me to go on TV and tell people not to wear masks. We had scientists who at one point said it was aerosolized and at another point said they didn't. Okay? Science is not always 100% definitive, but the other side was able to make the let's listen to the scientists a campaign theme. So here you are today, and your previous speaker talked about a third shot. Well, we have some scientists who say we need a booster shot. You have other scientists who say no, that's not proven yet. And now the Biden administration is having to explain why they're not listening to this scientist or that scientist. That's a product of the fact that the country is so divided and that we politicize everything. Brendan's point about things are politicized now that were never politicized when we were younger is exactly right. I don't remember talking about politics with my wife before we got married. We talked about having kids and where we go to church, what we want to do for a living, but I'm not sure I even know what party my mother's registered as. That's not conversations that we have. We didn't used to politicize everything. But we do now, and it is oftentimes, or at least it has been with COVID, to our detriment. There's no question about that.
And what about, say, foreign policy now and transatlantic relations?
Well, let's start with foreign policy, because one of the things that I cringe about what's happening in Afghanistan is that there are very few things now that have bipartisan support in my country. Support for the Good Friday agreements when it comes to Irish and British relations is one. Growing concern about China is another, and wanting to get out of Afghanistan is a third. I voted several times against the war when I was in Congress. I encouraged the president in his desire to remove the troops. President Obama wanted the troops out of Afghanistan. President Trump wanted them out. President Biden wanted them out. I think it's one of those things that we could have rallied to as a nation if it had been done better or correctly or properly. And I think the fact that it has not been executed well will further divide the country. I think if we had had a successful withdrawal of the troops, it could have been an opportunity for a healing, at least on foreign policy in the nation. We lost that opportunity, and that's disappointing to me.
And Brendan, how do you think that's being viewed from this side of the
Yeah,
Atlantic?
I don't have the same, although interestingly, I have the same opinion in terms of finally withdrawing our soldiers from Afghanistan after 20 years, longest engagement in American history, and well after we actually achieved the original intent of going in there. But I don't agree with Mick that this is something that is going to be politicized, or even that many voters, rightly or wrongly, will care about. For example, here we are just about a month after the full-scale pullout began and got underway. I think we're less than a month since the very quick fall of the country and the fall of Kabul. Afghanistan has been wiped off the national papers. Now, here in the U.S., we've been struggling with the remnants of a hurricane. I just surveyed historic damage in the city of Philadelphia, New York City, and the Northeast experienced it as well. That has been dominating the news here the last several days. But I have to say, I would be shocked if Afghanistan, in the U.S. at least, is even being talked about by most voters in a few weeks. I also find, I'm in my fourth term now, my first 2 terms, so my first 4 years in Congress, I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I have to say, as divided as U.S. politics may be on domestic issues, I did find foreign affairs was a nice respite from that. And, you had a number of Republican members on the committee who would speak up more forcefully than the Trump administration when it came to defending Ukraine or defending NATO. You would have, before that, you would have some Democratic members, myself included, who thought the administration could do more for the defense of Ukraine. So I have to say, generally speaking, while it might not be the same as, say, the Cold War era, on foreign affairs, you do have generally less polarization than you see on domestic affairs.
Do you agree? We have an unwritten rule in this country too. When it comes to foreign, the parties usually do band together.
Yeah, and we used to. That norm has eroded over time. It used to be that politics ended at the border, and then the administration, whoever the administration was sort of in charge of foreign policy. I don't know when it started to erode, but I remember, John Kerry coming out affirmatively against the Trump administration, former Secretary of State, on the Iran agreement. And I don't remember that from my youth. Again, I'm not claiming that it started under Trump. These things don't happen like that. They slowly change. And that you had a former Secretary of State taking a very public position against a sitting administration on an important matter of foreign policy. That is something that is relatively new. I don't see that getting much better. My point about Afghanistan was the opportunity existed to do something in with bipartisan support because the nation was there. The nation probably does not have an opinion one way or the other about the Iran nuclear agreements. But we've been dealing with Afghanistan for so long. So many of us know families who have lost family members overseas as part of the war that it was a little bit different. And I think it was the type of thing that could have brought us together and probably won't. Brendan's point is an excellent one, that it may fall from the news. There's no question about that, especially things are often overtaken by other events in our country. There's so much happening all the time. It doesn't surprise me that a hurricane comes through and the things change. And I'm not saying that it's the end of the Biden administration. I do think it hampers his ability to run again if he likes. What I'm saying, it was a lost opportunity because it was something we could have done together. that would have had bipartisan support.
And you've spent the last week or more traveling around Europe and traveling around this country, and it's still dominating headlines here.
It is.
And do you think it has damaged relations, the transatlantic relations?
You know, yes, but it, I can't get a feel for, because I don't know the politics here enough to know. Look, my friend Tom Cotton is beating up on Joe Biden for pulling out of Afghanistan. He does that because he's a very neoconservative, militaristic type of outlook, right? He would be critical of Trump in the same fashion. If a British minister takes a position against what Biden is doing, it's hard for me to know, is he doing that because he feels like America is letting him down, or is he doing that because he really wishes they had stayed in Afghanistan? I don't know the local politics enough of it to know. Do I think that our credibility is undermined when we execute poorly? I do. But I think some of the criticism would have existed even if we had pulled off the most perfect exit from that country. So that's probably not a very satisfying answer to your question, but I just don't get a feel. I don't know enough about who's saying what they're saying here to give you an educated answer.
Brendan, I heard you making a similar point earlier this week on radio, and it's one that Larry Donnelly makes too, that America's damned if it does and damned if it doesn't.
Oh, absolutely. You know, if the United States, in quote unquote, interferes in another country, the reaction by many around the world is, how dare that big, bad, arrogant United States throw its weight around? And then if the United States doesn't get involved in a situation, it's, my God, where is American leadership? They're the biggest, most powerful country in the world. They have a responsibility to get involved. So we are always kind of in that catch-22, and it's one that, you know, that I'm very familiar with. I think that probably, you know, goes with being, if you're the biggest on the block, you get the most attention and you're open for the most criticism. And I tend to think that as long as the U.S. Is in this position, that will always be there.
My wife made a comment to me, Eileen. We were watching a European news channel during breakfast one morning, because we actually can get some better news than we can get domestically. And there was this long segment on the plight of Afghan women now that the Americans had left. And her comment off the cuff was, where were those 30-minute pieces for the last 15 years? They were some places, but they certainly weren't front and center. So I'd like the damned if you do, damned if you don't type of attitude.
I think the thing is, Brendan, you might address that, you know, President Biden had said America is back. And with this, there was kind of a feeling, certainly the way it was reported on this side of the water, that actually it's America first.
First, I mean, no one should have been surprised that President Biden made this decision. He was very public in the campaign that this was something he absolutely intended to do. It was well known. He wanted to do this 10 years ago and advocated for it as vice president within the Obama administration. Former Defense Secretary Gates, who served actually in both Democratic and Republican administrations, wrote a whole memoir, and it included a passage about just how really passionate Biden was about withdrawing U.S. soldiers. Even though some of our allies, might not exactly be thrilled with our decision, the reality is, though, if you take a step back and you look at things holistically, whether it's defense of NATO, whether it's an overall approach to multilateralism, whether it's believing that we need to come together and act collectively, generally speaking, President Biden does put a premium on the transatlantic relationship. He's not, you see the way he has been received on his previous European tour, the way even when he was a former vice president, he was received at the Munich Security Conference. That's not all of a sudden out the window just because of a decision that was made on Afghanistan.
Okay, now you mentioned earlier Northern Ireland, and it's one thing that the two parties do agree on. And we heard, did you hear the speaker earlier in the Shared Island session, a journalist from Northern Ireland, saying that a lot of unionists were very angered by Nancy Pelosi's, you better sign up to this protocol or there won't be a UK-US trade deal, and felt that that was why Boris Johnson signed up. Now, other people would disagree with that. I wonder where you'd fall, Brendan.
Yeah, so first, a couple of years ago, in the spring of 2019, I, as you may know, was one of the members of Congress. In fact, I was the first to introduce a resolution on the House floor regarding the importance of protecting the Irish peace process from any damage as a result of Brexit. That damage maybe not intended, but my biggest fear was the unintended collateral damage that could result not just from Brexit, but the hardest possible version of Brexit. I made clear that, and I was glad to have full bipartisan support on this. The resolution passed the House of Representatives unanimously, that we stood by the Good Friday Agreement, and there could be absolutely no reconstruction of a border on the island of Ireland, and that we would continue to pursue that policy. And I accompanied the Speaker of the House and 8 other of my colleagues when we went to Downing Street and delivered that message to 10 Downing Street, as well as in Dublin and in Northern Ireland, including physically walking the border between counties Donegal and Derry. I would also point out, the reality is that when the U.S. decides to, speak up when it comes to the Irish peace process, there are always going to be those suspicions, particularly on the British side or the pro-unionist side, that we lean toward the green. That was certainly the case in the early 1990s. History has a way of whitewashing criticism of the past. I remember just how heavily Bill Clinton was criticized for the actions he took in the early 1990s. And he took a lot of criticism in the British press and as well as from others. And yet now that is looked back at as the golden days. And certainly the risks he took for peace, we all agree were well worth it. So again, I think anytime the US does something, especially when it's guys named Brendan Boyle and Mick Mulvaney and others, there is always going to be that suspicion, that we're leaning on one side more than the other.
And I needed to avoid that as the envoy, because that was clearly the risk that you run as you go into the office. As a devout Irish Catholic with a name like mine, that you'd be picking sides early on, and I tried hard not to do that. But it was easy to do that because, and Brendan and I talked about this fairly regularly when I was in the envoy position, the position of the Trump administration and the Biden administration was pretty similar. I've talked to Billy Tranghese a good bit, Brendan, when I was in the office as well, because there really wasn't that much dissension amongst American politicians when it came to the Good Friday Belfast agreements. Even there, it's Good Friday Belfast. You have to do that when you're in that particular role. He said something that was exactly right. I took criticism for saying essentially the same thing, which is we didn't want a border by accident. And I was poo-pooed by the Europeans we would never have that. We know how too important it is. We will never have a border again on the island of Ireland. And I said, look, I believe you. I believe that you don't want one. I believe you will work not to have one. I'm worried about you having one by accident. Oh, that would never happen. And it almost happened 6 months later with the vaccines. That could be you weren't allowed to export vaccines or something like that. What does that mean? You have to put up a border across Ulster to make sure that it's not crossing. So it is a challenge. Many things with Northern Ireland are going to be a challenge. There's no question about it. I think the Biden administration is playing it right down the middle, and I think that's what they need to do, which is, look, the British signed the deal. It shouldn't be controversial to say, look, we would like you to simply live up to the terms of what you. That shouldn't be outrageous, and it isn't. And as much as we could sit here a long time, and I come with things that I don't like about Nancy Pelosi, but asking the British, insisting on the British living up to the terms of the deal they cut, I don't think is an outrageous position. And defending the Good Friday Agreement is something that you will continue to see the American government do, regardless of who is there.
Okay. We're beginning to run out of time. And Larry, we started the clock a bit late here, so if you just give me a sign when you need me to wrap up. I'm going to throw it to the floor for the moment if anybody would like to have a comment or raise a question. Yeah?
How do I think that demographics, both race and age, are going to impact the divisiveness in my country? Brandon, you want to go first? You want me to go?
I'm happy to take it because I have, perhaps it'll be interesting. I have maybe a somewhat unpopular or less stated view. I believe the changing demographics of America, that storyline, I believe, is the single most exaggerated story in America today. The demographics of the United States are changing. Guess what? They've always been changing. There was a time 100 years ago when neither Mick nor I would be considered white, even though I am pretty clearly pasty-faced and white, as Mick is as well. We would not have been considered in the American mainstream, and yet clearly are today. And if I were to go, to part of my district in North Philadelphia, which is heavily African American, and say that, they would, find that quite hilarious that at one point American society was really worried that, my goodness, all of these Irish Catholics and Italian Catholics and Eastern Europeans and Jews are really going to change America, and led to some of the deadliest riots. Still to this day, the deadliest riot in Philadelphia's history. It's not a race riot. It was a race riot for what was considered race back then. It was in the 1840s, and it was an anti-Irish and an anti-Catholic riot. So yes, America is getting more Latino. The census results literally just came out 1 month ago. They show we're a nation of 331 million people. The white percentage has dropped a bit from where it was 10 years ago. The African American percentage is actually stable. It's been consistently around 12% for many, many decades. It's the Latino percentage. So when they talk about the browning of America, it's the Latino segment of society that's growing. But guess what? Like European, Latino is a very big bucket of a lot of different folks with very different experiences and family trees. A very big difference, as Mick knows, from the Cuban Americans in South Florida than, say, the Puerto Ricans in New York and Philadelphia, or the Venezuelan Americans who populate in Central Florida. So I tend to think that, the Latino Americans of today, and especially of tomorrow, will follow in likely that same old American immigration story. And the idea that it's guaranteed that their kids and grandkids are going to be voting the same way, or even ethnically identifying the same way as their parents and grandparents, I think it is wrong-headed, and in the end will prove much ado about nothing.
I think he's absolutely right. It's the one thing we really know how to do well, or at least have, is to integrate people. That's one of the things I come back to the comments about what we don't share anymore. We don't read the same books. We don't watch the same television programs. We don't always sing the same national anthem, because that's not who we are. We are the melting pot, and you bring your piece and you bring yours, and that becomes sort of America. And does America change? Yes, it does. I grew up Roman Catholic in the South. In my state, less than 1% of the population was Roman Catholic. Today, the largest church of any denomination in my state is 35,000 people, St. Matthew's Parish. Things do change. I welcome it politically. Your question wasn't about politics, it was about divisiveness, but I'll take it to the next step, which is I am rare amongst my party. I want more immigration. I want more. It's good for the country, number one. It's healthy economically, number two, but just strictly politically, if you're a first or second generation immigrant, you're more likely to vote for me than you are for him. Think about what the Hispanics are. Yes, the Puerto Ricans in New York are different than the Cubans in Miami, but these folks are American. That the folks coming in, they want to be American. They want their kids to get married. They want their kids to stay married. They want they want to go to church. They want to buy their own house. They want to, they take care of their families and so forth. They're open. They could go Democrat or Republican 50-50. And I think that's great. And I wish that we would encourage that more. We don't, and that worries me a little bit. But as long as we are ourselves and do what we do well as a country, I think the more immigration you have the potential to have it reduce the divisiveness, because it may be, to the point we made before about how do you change things, if there's this group of 35%, I don't know what the Hispanic number is right now, Brendan, but let's say it's 30% a year from now. I know it's bigger than the African American population.
18%.
Is it 18? If there's a pot of 18% of the population that could go either way, between Republican and Democrat, maybe that's what it takes to get our parties to start trying to figure out a way to convince people to agree with us, as opposed to demonizing the people that don't. So there's an opportunity that I welcome.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah.
Is the Republican Party, for those viewing from home, suffering from an identity crisis?
Identity crisis. It's internal division. It's the same on the other half, on the other side. I mean, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Jim Cooper are not the same person, and they are going to continue. Jim Cooper's I think one of the last of the Blue Dog Democrats from the American South. Is he still in Congress? Is he gone now, Brendan?
No, he's still in Congress,
Okay.
although he might be redistricted out because Republicans control the state legislature there in Tennessee. But he's still in Congress.
He's still there. So I think the better question is, Trump forced us to reconsider a lot of what we represented from a policy standpoint. I'll give you an example. If Paul Ryan were here 4 years ago speaking, he would be the single biggest advocate for absolute unrestricted free trade across the planet. He just is. That's the way he was hardwired. By the way, it was the way I was instructed as well. I have the same academic background. If you're trained in Western economics, you pretty much are trained to think that free trade is unreservedly a good thing. Trump is forcing us to reconsider that and say, is it really a good idea to have free trade with China? That's a fair question, and it's causing us to rethink what we might stand for as a Republican Party. He was dead set about getting us out of Afghanistan. He was much less interventionist than, say, George Bush was. And so I think that causes us to sort of have that internal discussion about what does it mean to be a Republican. Do I think you come down full square on one of those things or the other? No. But I think the fact you have the debate is part of that internal discussion that both parties are going to have. Again, I come back to the fact we have 331 million people in our country and two parties. To think that either of them is going to be 100% monolithic is just not reasonable.
I'm going to give the last question to our youngest guest this evening. We have Noel's son, Seamus, here. Brendan, he introduced our previous guest, and he's got a question. Have you, Seamus?
Yeah.
Altering primaries to encourage cooperation. What's the best way to do that?
Very briefly, I'll throw in my thing for that weighted voting, that you have a system where you don't use gerrymandering is a science. By the way,
now, explain that, because that has different connotations in this country.
Oh, does it? Okay.
Yes. It surely does.
Yes.
I'll tell you later in the Greek.
Separated by a common language, right? Okay, so Elbridge Gerry, 200 years ago, there was a district, he was a member of the House, and it was in Massachusetts, I believe, and it was drawn in such a convoluted way to make sure he won re-election. It actually looked like a salamander. It went like this all the way through Massachusetts, picking up his voters so that he could keep his seat. And the combination of his name, Elbridge Gerry, and the salamander became gerrymandering. Essentially what it essentially does says, look, I know where my voters are, you know where your voters are. I tell you what, let's create a district where all my voters are in my district and all your voters in your district, and we'll both keep this job forever. That's what we do. Anything that fixes that will help. Some states have tried it using independent commissions. Some states have tried it using judges. None of those things seem to change the outcome. If you got rid of those, they're not required in our Constitution. It's an artifice. You got rid of that and simply said, okay, South Carolina is going to nominate 7 people, and here's the top 7. Maybe that's a chance to do it.
Brendan?
Well, great question.
Do you, by the way, before you answer this, do you know what gerrymandering means in Irish? Because I have no idea.
No, I was interested in that. Hopefully, she'll educate us, right as we wrap up.
I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. I can feel it.
I'll just say, in terms of 2 quick. You asked about primaries, but let me expand it a little bit and offer 2 reforms. First, there's no question that I believe that it needs to be reform. As I spoke earlier of our primary elections, I think a lot of the dysfunction in our politics today, certainly not all of it, but a good degree of it, has to do with so many of our districts being decided in low turnout primary elections. So expanding that so that way everyone can participate in one election, having either a top 2 or a top 4 system that advance to a general. So that way, if you're a Democratic candidate, you can appeal and have independents and some Republicans vote for you, and vice versa. Now, still, it's harder in practice than that sounds in theory. You do have a few states that have experimented with top 2. You do sometimes run into anomalies even there, though. But nonetheless, some sort of reform like that. And then Mick talked about it earlier, and Democrats right now are pushing it, among other reforms, and we're getting opposition from Republicans, and that is redistricting reform. In my view, there should be a federal law putting guardrails when it comes to gerrymandering, because again, gerrymandering helps lead to the drawing of either overwhelmingly Democratic safe seats or overwhelmingly Republican safe seats. And that skews the wishes of all of the people that live in a certain area. So if I lived in South Carolina, say, and Mick and I were drawing the map, I could draw it in such a way, and it's easier now with technology, where I get the Democratic neighborhoods and the Democratic wards. He would get the Republicans. We're both safe. Even though actually overall it might be quite a competitive area, and we would have just drawn in a competitive area a safe Democratic seat and a safe Republican seat, where both the results of both districts are being determined in
Brendan,
primary
I don't know if you know this or not. Very, very briefly, North Carolina in 2010 was a very narrow election for president. Yet it had a 9-4, I believe, Republican majority in the House. Same group of people statewide.
Yep. Pennsylvania, Mick, Pennsylvania from 2010 to 2018. Pennsylvania, and now I think thanks to our election, every relative I have in Ireland now can name the 67 counties of Pennsylvania because of the way our election went into to overtime. Pennsylvania, perennially a very close state. I would say the closest of the big battleground states. From 2010 to 2018, we had 18 members of the House, 13 Republicans, 5 Democrats. Because in 2010, then a Republican-controlled legislature and a Republican governor were able to gerrymander the map in that way, even in a state that sometimes votes Democratic, but is generally around 50-50. It distorts the will of the people, and that's why I'm so against gerrymandering.
Okay, and we're going to have to wrap it there, lads, because we're over time. I'll tell you about the gerrymandering when I get you here in person next year, Brendan.
Oh, no.
Listen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been a pleasure to have you here. And Mick, it's been a pleasure too. We want to know, though, are you going to go back into politics?
No. I'm done. So
You
it's
heard
a
it
lot
here,
more fun.
folks.
Brandon, I got news
You
for you.
heard it here, folks.
It's a lot more fun when you can give your opinion and not care what people think. It's fantastic.
Okay. Representative Brendan Boyle and Mick Mulvaney, thank you both.
Thanks.
Thank you.